The resentment is kind of a classic witch trope of wanting others to suffer, and their special familiar ability is overpowered. I'm going to say this now, and I think it should be eroded. Here's a Rules Lawyer detailed report on the new things we found out about the upcoming Pathfinder 2e remaster that Paizo presented on during Gen Con this weekend. We got to see actual pages from the books that come out this November, and I'll be sprinkling in some Rules Lawyer opinions throughout, of course. The remaster is what I'm calling version 2.1. It's a new edition, but it's an incremental edition that was necessitated by Wizards of the Coast making clear that iterating off of the D&D rules is not a reliable prospect to base nearly all of your publications on. Revising the rules so that it cuts the umbilical cord to D&D and its traditions has necessitated also an occasion for the design team to make improvements to the game a polish, so to speak. The essential math of the system is unchanged, and we should be able to use the vast majority of content we have with the remaster. Before I go into things, I need to say I will assume you've already seen and followed the coverage of the Pathfinder Core Preview PDF that was put out a couple weeks ago now. It lets people who have the new Rage of Elements book that comes out now to be able to use it before the remaster comes out this November. Because I'm assuming you've seen that coverage, I will focus on the new stuff that goes beyond what we saw there. I am Ronald of the Rules Lawyer. I am a lawyer who has also GM'd Pathfinder 1st and 2nd edition, Starfinder, and D&D 5th edition, and have experience running an after-school middle school program to learn RPGs. Make sure to like and subscribe, and also consider supporting my Patreon, where you get 7-day early access to most of my videos, and you can also access exclusive videos, including the great chat I had recently with members of my Discord to prepare for my How to Caster Good instructional video, and my ongoing D&D YouTubers Learn Pathfinder 2e campaigns. Also, some of the nuggets that I'll be sharing with you today would not have been possible. I would not have found them had it not been for the help of my very helpful and the amazing Discord community that you should all join, where we talk about Pathfinder, gaming, and where you can also meet people to play Pathfinder 2e. So it is Gen Con, the biggest gaming convention of the year, and Paizo did its presentation on the upcoming Pathfinder Remaster. Before I go into what they talked about, I'll actually talk about first the big thing that they did not talk about. As of 7 days ago, as of the time of this recording, the big rage in the Pathfinder 2e online communities was about Paizo possibly lowering the damage of caster cantrips, and there has been a kind of rebellion among players on that issue. Basically, they're removing the caster modifier bonus to damage cantrips going forward. A lot of that outrage has simmered a bit since the great, amazing news of Starfinder 2e coming out, but some people were expecting Paizo to address this uproar, and they did not. Well, not directly, at least. What we saw was this. The closest we got was this statement a few days ago, actually, during the keynote address from Logan Bonner, the lead designer for Pathfinder.
The cool thing about the remaster is that it is a remaster. It's not a new edition. What it's doing is still going to make almost all the stuff already printed for Pathfinder 2nd edition still usable in your new games. If there's a spell that was in core rulebook and we removed it, you can still use that spell. It's still going to work within the rules. And for anything that requires a little bit of adaptation, we're going to have some guidelines for those.
So it was a reminder from them that spells from the core rulebook can still be used with the remaster, which I assume will also be true with Pathfinder Society, the official organized play program. So on to the player core. They went systematically through the sections of the book, it seemed, from front to back. But first they pointed out something that is a little less snazzy to show in a stream, but is probably going to be the most helpful thing for people, which is that they have rewritten and reorganized the text and presented it more clearly with clearer headers. And also this lovely sidebar on the right-hand side. In the core rulebook, we only got to see the name of each chapter, but now we get to see the subdivisions of each chapter. And for playing the game, if you go to that section of the book, you can, at a glance, see where you can find the rules for the basic actions, which are referred to very often in play, especially when you're learning. The death and dying rules as well. The rules for cover and flanking. Counteracting, exploration mode. It's going to be so much easier to navigate the book with this thing on the side, and other RPG publishers should take note. I believe they were going from front to back in the book, and so they started with Ancestries. We had no surprises there. I do have a question, though. I had been under the impression that we would be getting rule support for allowing someone who was half halfling or half Leshy to be applied as a heritage to any other ancestry. However, it's not clear to me whether that's true. This text here only refers to half-elven Ayuvaran and orc-blooded Dromar. So we will see. They did, after all, in the core rulebook, have their own set of half-elf and half-orc feats, so maybe we won't see an equal treatment for others. Hopefully there will be a sidebar, I'm hoping. At least. Then we heard more about what they plan to do with the nephilim, which initially I was a little meh about when I heard about it, but I got really excited about when I heard what they're doing in the stream. Nephilim is an umbrella term for those who have a lineage that goes back somehow to other planar beings like angels or fiends, which historically under D&D have been represented through Aasimars and tieflings, and Pathfinder expanded on that with Aphorites and Ganzis. Now they're all going to be combined under this single versatile heritage called Nephilim. Part of this, I'm sure, is related to the remaster abandoning alignment, or at least it's a mindset difference, because there's no longer this boxing of everything into separate categories. There's no need to do that now. And on the stream, they talked about how a lot of the features and feats that would be available for, say, Aasimars, which are related to celestials, compared to tieflings who are related to fiends, there would be overlap. Now, this might sound strange to many of us who are used to seeing and imagining angels as being super perfect beings that look like humans with wings. But when you look at actual mythology and history, angels are pretty freakish. Here's some language from the Christian Bible that shows that angels are sometimes portrayed as terrifying and awe-inspiring. And you have religions that have gods or other celestial beings resembling animals, represented by the recent playtest for the next edition of D&D with the Ardlings. But fortunately for Pathfinder, we don't have to have a separate railroad for each of these concepts. You can smoosh them together and allow an individual player to tailor their character and draw from one or more of these traditions, and that can include a combination of them. The way Michael Sayer put it in the stream was that the different heritages were like separate tracks, and they are now allowed to combine these tracks. You have the option, but it is an option, to get a lineage that ties you with one of the traditional things, let's call them, like angels or daemons or devils. Then there's a separate feat, for example, for bestial manifestation, to get claw, hoof, jaws, or tail. You can do that as an angel or as one of the others. This also means you can choose to have traditionally angel-like things and traditionally devil-like things in your ancestry, and they talked about you yourself being a manifestation of the struggle between holy and unholy. And so we get to express a very common trope in fiction as well, through your own origins. So overall, it's the Pathfinder modular approach to class design being further developed in how they bring us Ancestries. Now, one person on my server pointed out something very interesting. Many Ancestries have a X lore feat. So if you're a dwarf, you can take a dwarven lore. That gives you a few skills, including lore in your ancestry. It would only train you in your lore, however. Now, here we see that it gives you, in the case of Nephilim, additional lore. The feat that not only trains you, but also auto-advances your proficiency in that lore as you level up. It makes you legendary in that lore at level 15. Hopefully we will see this with the other Ancestries, but that is a good change. Then they moved on to changes in some of the classes, which I'm sure many of you watching are most interested in. They talked about the fighter, and we got to see a couple of pages about the fighter, and they said a few things that confirm my rules lawyer theory, which is that they kind of know that the fighter is a nudge more powerful than some other classes, or at least we can accept that that's been many players' experience, and that they want to bring other classes up a bit so that they are more comparable to the fighter. I'll present my evidence and submit this to the jury. Let's just listen to how they compare the changes they're making to the fighter to what they're doing to the other classes.
Now, this book has 8 classes in it. They are, they have varying levels of changes, right? The fighter didn't see vast changes. But some of the other ones did see some substantive, alterations and corrections.
And then James Case said the following.
So we have the bard, we have the cleric, the druid, the fighter, the ranger, the rogue, the witch, and the wizard. And like Jason said, we had kind of a varying level to look at here. So kind of to start at one end of the scale, let's take a look at the fighter. The fighter was not a class that we had large amount of changes to. As you know, most people, I have seen how some members of the editing team land their fighter crits. I do not think it can be said that the fighter does not perform its role at the table. But even so, there are quality of life changes we could make for any of these.
So that's that on that. Next, we got some preview pages, and we see a fat list of feats. And one of the things that they said they were doing was combining the feats from the core rulebook with those from the Advanced Player's Guide while revisiting them at the same time. But my quick count, I may be off by a little, but they went from 61 feats in the core rulebook fighter to 96 here. They also have removed the open trait, which was a trait that many people glossed over, which applied to a few feats that required you basically to do something as the first thing you did on your turn. At least you couldn't have attacked before doing it on your turn. Now, Sudden Charge, which had that trait, you can do after striking somebody to get over to somebody on the other side of the battlefield. A minor buff, but also seemingly more of a quality of life change and to shed something that wasn't doing much in terms of rules complexity. So that was it on the fighter. We didn't get a whole lot compared to what we're about to see with regard to the cleric. The big change to mention, of course, is that alignment is being removed, and with it, alignment damage. Alignment damage, its role in the system is now going to be served through
spirit
damage, attacking the spiritual essence of something, which can have the holy or unholy trait tagged onto it, depending on what spell you're using, or whether you are, in the case of a cleric, sanctified to be holy or unholy. The big news for the community is that the Divine Font, that set of bonus spell slots you got per day for heal spells or harm spells, no longer scales with how high your charisma score is. Now, at level 1, you get 4 slots in your Divine Font, and Michael Sayer confirmed on Discord that this scales up to 5 at 5th level and 6 at 15th level. This means that you no longer, as a cleric, need to worry about getting your charisma high if you want to be more effective at using one of your core class features, making it less of a mad, multiple ability dependent class, which was particularly problematic for war priests, the subclass for the cleric who was more martially inclined. That was another concern of the designers, to buff the war priest in relation to the cloistered cleric. They repeated some of their previous announcements about becoming expert in all martial weapons and becoming master at 19th level, and there being a low-level class feat that lets you become proficient with heavy armor, a feat that the cloistered cleric will not have access to. We also see a welcome change in terminology with regard to some class features. Currently, the cleric gets alertness at 5th level, now called perception expertise. If one were to not know much about the cleric and just read alertness and also lightning reflexes at 11th level, one would think, oh, clerics are very alert and have lightning reflexes. But what those features essentially did was make you catch up to other classes in something that you were behind on. So this lessens the confusion about that, and also just has the proficiency level in the name, making it clearer. So that's welcome. They also talked about how one could be sanctified as a cleric, and how some deities don't care whether you are sanctified. Sarenrae, the goddess of redemption, doesn't require that you be sanctified if you're one of her followers. However, Asmodeus, who currently is lawful evil, does want all of his followers to be on the program and have their loyalty assured. Also, the sanctified trait is interesting. The effect of the sanctified trait to an effect or spell is that if you are holy or unholy, have one of those traits, that makes that effect or spell holy or unholy. And I've been struggling to wrap my head around the purpose of some of these traits, and what I've come to understand, I think, is that sanctified, it serves as a placeholder for some effects that you can turn like a ballista in one direction or the other in the war against evil or against good. And not everything that you might think would have that trait will have that trait and have that option. For example, the heal spell does not have that by default. We learn through implication by the fact that this feat allows the cleric to add the unholy or holy trait to the heal spell or the harm spell. So that must mean that the heal and harm spells are not spells that have the sanctified trait. You need to spend this class feat. And in this case, it actually expands its use. Normally, the heal spell only deals damage to undead creatures. And I assume that damage will be called vitality damage in the remaster. That would mean it would normally not damage devils and demons. But now, this feat, which is an adaptation of Holy Castigation in the current edition, means that you can alternatively do spirit damage, which again is our type of damage that can itself become holy or unholy, and trigger a weakness to holy damage in the case of a devil. But also, essentially, spirit damage can harm any creature, whether you're alive or dead. Now, this just seems like a more complicated way to accomplish what Holy Castigation currently does with alignment. This feat lets heal spells damage fiends as though they were undead. However, this allows more modularity, and also, remember, not everything that is unholy is a fiend. You can have an opposing cleric who is evil, who is sanctified as unholy, or an anti-paladin, or a whole variety of creatures that might fall outside of being a fiend. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. There could be some supervillains who are signed up for the unholy war, a riff off of a phrase I'm ripping off of the Undeniably Good Time channel. And you'd be able to use not only the harm spell against that super evil cleric, but also the heal spell, and area effect heal all of your allies while harming that super evil unholy cleric. So anyway, a lot of new possibilities are going to exist. I do, however, have a question that is not, the answer to which is not clear to me yet, which is currently with alignment, if you are a good aligned cleric, an anathema would be to cast a spell that has the evil trait. So you wouldn't be able to cast Bind Soul, for instance. Now, I'm going to assume, but I'm not sure, that if you were to sanctify yourself, you will be prohibited from using effects and spells that are unholy. Spells like this and Chilling Darkness. The next class we learned more about was the Witch, and they've been pretty explicit that this is the class that they will make the most of a revisit of in terms of rebalancing it and making it more interesting and fun. They repeated their clear aim that they want to dial up the flavor of the class, make clear what your patron could possibly be, and also make your familiar, your special animal friend, magical friend, and your patron feel more involved in what you're doing. They've also confirmed in what they said something that I've been thinking. I've been wondering why include the Witch in Player Core 1, as opposed to a number of other classes one would expect in the core book. And they said that the Witch concept is popular and iconic. In some of my own D&D YouTuber campaigns, the Witch has been a class that's been gravitated toward, and they specifically said that D&D doesn't provide that. It just seems like a really popular concept, and in the case of people who are jumping in with the remaster, it presents as a class that can do any magical tradition, so kind of showing off the versatility of that system. The biggest mechanical change and buff that we're seeing with this new Witch is the fact that your familiar does something when you cast a hex spell or sustain a hex. It's essentially a free action in combat, and that incentivizes you to use your hexes more. They had said that the initial intent of the Witch was to make it the premier familiar class, magical familiar class. But as it turned out, it was possible to use other classes and archetypes to surpass the Witch in the number of abilities that they get from their familiar, or to at least steal their fire. But for familiars to have unique abilities that no other class can take from the Witch now preserves that original intent. They definitely did add more of a sense of your patron. I'm going to go through each one briefly. What I found from looking at it, and I appreciate, is that it's pretty clear when you look at them, kind of their role. not only their flavor, but their role and what you want to contribute to the party. So when we look at the original presentation of the witch, you can see there was kind of not much. It was just a single sentence with 4 things it gave you. But as we go through these, it's pretty clear kind of what playstyle it is steering you toward. So Fate's Flamekeeper, its flavor text suggests something protective and assuring and warm. It has a divine spell tradition, and its special familiar ability is to give temporary hit points to a creature who's nearby. The inscribed one has to do with words and glyphs and symbols, and their spell list is arcane, and their special familiar ability is to manifest those symbols and to distract an enemy, thus allowing the familiar, who normally can't provide flanking, the ability to provide flanking. The resentment is kind of a classic witch trope of wanting others to suffer, and also the idea of vengeance. This is the occult spell list, and their special familiar ability is overpowered! I'm going to say this now, and I think it should be eroded. It is much more powerful than the other ones. It basically says that when you sustain or cast a hex, your familiar can curse a creature and prolong the duration of any negative conditions affecting it by 1 round. There is no save required by that creature. It's also not clear what exactly are conditions. Is that simply things with a number like Frightened 1, Enfeebled 1, or does it include status penalties to speed, or poisons, or a whole variety of things that debuff somebody in this system? Prone is technically a condition in Pathfinder 2e, and it's also plural conditions. And there are some mighty powerful debuff spells in this game. The poster child is Synesthesia, a very powerful spell that causes their brain to suddenly rewire. It lasts 1 minute, does not require the caster to sustain it, and does not have the incapacitation trait. It requires the target to do a DC 5 flat check every time they try to do a concentrate action or waste the action. All creatures that they have to see to target are concealed to it, and it is clumsy 3, essentially giving +3 to the entire party to attack its AC, and a -10-foot status penalty to its speeds. If they succeed on their save, they're still affected by 1 round, and this would seem to sustain all of those effects forever, so long as you do a hex every round, by one reading of it. So it has a problem of possibly being too powerful and also being unclear. Vague and overbroad in lawyer speak. And kind of aside to this current aside, they said, they emphasized that you can still use the old spells from the core rulebook next to spells from the remaster, I believe, to allay some anger that might result from some spells being changed in the remaster. We've already seen that with regards to the cantrips. I believe, and I hope, that they are revisiting spells to tune some weaker spells up, but also to tune some strong spells down. I'm looking at you, Slow and Synesthesia, which I think if they had the incapacitation trait would make them in line with other spells of their levels. And yes, I expect a lot of caster players to throw tomatoes at me, but I, as a GM, think it would be good for the game. All right, that's a controversial opinion. Another one from me. Next one, Silence and Snow. The theme is more mysterious than the others. Basically, they are powerful and has to do with cold. The spell list is primal, and the special familiar ability is when you cast or sustain a hex, the familiar creates a 5-foot burst of ice that is difficult terrain. How it actually is targeted is a little unclear from the language. I will point that out. Next is Spinner of Threads. This is like the Fate Witch. The description talks about different realities and different times. This, of course, is the occult spell tradition. And the special familiar ability is to either give a +1 to a nearby creature's AC or a -1 to their AC. Starless Shadow is about something mysterious in the dark. And the special familiar ability here is that if the familiar is concealed or more in relation to an enemy creature, it will make that enemy creature frightened 1. Wilding Steward is basically the Nature Witch, the primal spell tradition, and when you cast or sustain a hex, Your familiar gets some animal-like sense, like imprecise scent, tremor sense, or wave sense to a range of 60 feet, and as a free action can point out to the whole party the location of something, which of course in situations facing invisible enemies and the like can be extremely valuable. So as we can already see so far, the familiar in the new witch is not something you just store in your backpack so that they don't die, a living spellbook with eyes. It's something that you want to deploy and position in combat now, which does raise a concern about its vulnerability. But we further get more of the feel of the familiar through the witch feats that we were shown. We have a couple of feats that I call non-focus spell focus spells. Basically, there's something your familiar can do that's kind of like an offensive ability. In this case of Spirit Familiar, it can fly into an enemy, inflict spirit damage, and then fly into an ally and give some healing. Or Stitched Familiar, transforming the familiar into harmful energy, doing slashing damage to a nearby foe. These take 2 actions like many spells and can only be done once per 10 minutes. And this is separate from your focus points pool. It's almost like a bonus extra focus point ability that you can have via your familiar. They also pointed out Ceremonial Knife, where basically you can create a magic wand in the morning in the form of a knife that is 2 spell ranks lower than your highest spell rank. Wands in 2E let you cast the spell once per day, but also you can overcharge it to cast it a second time at the risk of almost certainly destroying it in the process. But Ceremonial Knife lets you do it every morning, so have at it. Let it get destroyed. I've seen online the comment that you can make an unlimited number of knives. There's clearly a missing sentence here. It should end with your next daily preparations. And in the live stream, it was clear that that was the designer's intent. They used the phrase rest of the day to describe what this knife provides for you. They also talked about a feat that wasn't in their screenshots that combined old feats together that let you attack with your nails or your hair. Not only are they combined together so that you can have both abilities if you want, but you also can debuff the target against your hexes as a result. So giving you some mechanical reason to actually attack with your hair, independent from it being cool, is a good thing. We also saw, they didn't talk about this, but I want to highlight it, Witch's Bottle, where basically you get to invest a focus point into a consumable item that someone can drink that imparts the effect of a hex of yours. So I assume a positive hex. This essentially puts the action economy cost on your ally instead of yourself, giving you some more versatility. But I also really like the fact that if you have the Cackle hex, which extends the effect of something by a round, you could put that into the bottle too and put another focus point in it. But when they unstopper it, the laugh sounds out. I just thought that was some cool flavor. Also notable that they didn't talk about was the double class feat. The prerequisite is the Cauldron feat, which currently is a level 1 feat that allows the witch to brew potions. But it's clear from the title and the text here that it now looks like that feat additionally lets you prepare 1 potion for free every morning that only lasts that day. And under the current system, use 4 days of downtime to get the benefit of Cauldron. It looks like you can just get a free potion slot per day at level 1, which is probably a buff that is welcome. Also, very cool that we saw that they didn't talk about was the Coven spell feat, where when an ally within 30 feet of you casts a spell, you can increase its damage, or you can apply a metamagic, quote unquote, now called spell shape effect that you can do to their spell. It's a design space I haven't seen before that I'm glad is being introduced here, where spellcasters can boost each other in spellcasting. The next class, and the last class they covered, was the Wizard. And I'm going to point out there's a couple of cool class feats that we got no explanation of. Explosive Arrival and Secondary Detonation Array. Anyway, it looks like there's some new ideas that we're going to see in the Wizard feats, and I'm hoping that spellcaster feats are a little more lively and exciting this time around. They tended to be bland and unremarkable, was one of the common observations that I've seen in the current crop of casters. But the big news is the moving away from the 8 traditional schools of magic. rooted in D&D. They're now replaced by actual schools in Galarian, the default campaign setting, and we have these names of these schools. And I really liked the write-ups of these. They not only were evocative and cool, but they also placed them in a specific context. It's more believable, rich, in my opinion, but also helps to protect themselves from Wizards of the Coast because they're rooted and have their own justification in their own product identity. Each school provides a relatively small list of spells compared to the old 8 schools, which every single spell in the current edition belongs to one of the 8 schools. So you have over 100 spells that you could put in your specialist wizard slot currently. But now we have a much smaller list. However, these spells are focused on the theme and therefore not limited to the 8 traditional schools. For example, the School of Battle Magic, which is probably what blaster casters or people who want to be evokers in the current edition would gravitate towards, is not limited to what would be called evocation spells now of manipulating energy, damaging people, and moving things around. We have spells that are unified by the idea of colleges in nations that are at war wanting to train their wizards to cast spells that help in the battlefield. Spells that are not evocation currently, like Mystic Armor, Mist, Resist Energy, Earthbind, which brings down flying foes, Energy Aegis. So we have some spells that are arguably defensive or buff spells, things that might be under abjuration or transmutation. Also, the GM might allow you to swap or add other spells to your curriculum if they strongly fit the theme. So the text gives permission to the GM and the player to tailor these as well. Now, something I noticed, which was interesting, I had thought that being a universalist in the current edition, which simply means you don't specialize in a school period and therefore get these other side benefits, I thought that would be the same treatment here. But the way this is written assumes every wizard has an arcane school. So universalism, if it is expressed, would be expressed in a school that has its own spell slot that must be committed to one of the schools in its curriculum and has a focus spell. So that was interesting to me. We'll see what that is, but currently we don't know. I also have to give props to what we heard about the School of Protean Form, which sounds like an adaptation of the current Transmutation School of changing the form of things. This now has its own in-world justification of being flesh warp colleges and places where you study how to manipulate the body. They use the phrase mad scientist to explain the nature of these schools, and I'm all for it. I just think that's a definite improvement in the flavor. They also said that this new system of having actual schools with defined curriculums or curricula is going to open things up to have many more schools in the future. So I'm sure we're going to see Lost Omens books and future themed rule books have more schools with their own unique focus spells. Things like a Goblin School of Pyromancy that one of them kind of jokingly talked about possibly having. For people who support my Patreon, I already made a video about this issue and said that would be a cool idea. It just sounds like a lot of new design space for the designers and players to have fun.
There is something else we see that is highly interesting. There are uncommon spells included in these curriculums, including the teleport spell, for example, for School of the Boundary. Overall, uncommon spells are supposed to be things you're supposed to get GM permission to get access to. A GM can very well prohibit spells that are uncommon for whatever reason. It prevents them from telling certain kinds of stories. The teleport spell obviously makes the road trip story trope less possible. This in itself already kind of screams to the GM that these are for you to craft and tailor to your campaign. It also might present a difficulty to some GMs who may not want teleport in their campaign, and they will need to tell that player no. On the other hand, the player being able to choose from the whole list of spells to substitute something in, I think they're being given some more freedom in that instance.
I do have one criticism, however, that I've seen online. My video that patrons can see now supports Paizo's decision to move away from the 8 arcane schools, which I think is also kind of legally safe for them to do and kind of necessitated by the situation anyway. I don't agree with the critics of that decision. However, there is one comment that I acknowledge is a flaw in the implementation of how they've gone about it, which is in the case of the School of Battle Magic, for instance, there are some spells that don't scale well. In the first rank, you have Breathe Fire, which is Burning Hands, Force Barrage, which is Magic Missile, and Mystic Armor, which is Mage Armor. By the time you become a 7th level character, this essentially becomes a dead slot if the GM is not allowing you to replace them with something else. Because damaging spells, they will still be doing the same amount of damage they did at first level. I do think it would be good for Paizo to errata these or offer an alternative spell list that allow, for example, True Strike, or Sure Strike in this edition, to be one of the first rank spells of this battle magic school. Particularly, and this has been said online, since organized play, Pathfinder Society, probably can't give the kind of flexibility this book gives to GMs to allow for players to swap in or add spells to their curriculum. Then they gave a little preview of what they're doing with the athletics skill. And the big news is what they didn't talk about, that a lot of people latched onto, which is the fact that athletics maneuvers, I'll call them, like grapple and trip, now are agile by default, because you're usually going to be using your free hand, because that's required to do those maneuvers. So they have a multiple attack penalty of only -4 and -8 on the third attack. One, this is more elegant, rules-wise, and there's been a lot of confusion online caused by the current rules, and I welcome this more clarity. And it's a slight buff to those maneuvers. But what they did highlight was the new Reposition action, which already existed in first edition Pathfinder. It was one of the things you could do while you were grappling somebody. Now, you can do this either when you're grabbing or restraining them, or when you simply have a free hand. You don't have to grab them. It keys off of their Fortitude DC, so their Fortitude DC, that makes sense. You know, they don't want to be moved. And you can move them 5 feet, but must still be within your reach and cannot be into or through obstacles. Critical success means you get to move them 10 feet. Some people on my server said, hey, maybe this means that some weapons will have the reposition trait, which I think would be awesome. I'm also intrigued by the possibility that you can strategically move your allies around with this action. Maybe you want to move them so that they get into a flanking position and don't have to waste an action on their turn to do so. And according to Logan Bonner, it's not a rule, but a guideline given in Bestiary 3 that a GM can allow a player to adjust their degree of success by 1 if it is something that the actor and the target both agree on. I also wonder too, because this is forced movement, whether you can move an ally away from the reach of a creature who has attack of opportunity. I would like clarity on this rule and whether people can use it this way. I also wonder whether this could be extended to dragging an unconscious party member. Currently, under the rules, it takes approximately 1 minute to drag someone 50 feet and you need both hands free. This doesn't rule that out. However, I can see the rule for dragging being harder because they're just lying there. So I have questions about that. Also, I noticed that they brought in the sidebar about leap here next to high jump and long jump, which in the core rulebook currently assume that you know what leap does several hundred pages later in the book. And I appreciate that. And to make it clearer, high jump, if you succeed, lets you jump 5 feet horizontally as well as vertically, which was true currently, but I like to have it printed out there. Long jump also has a significant change. Currently, you have to kind of make a gamble and say, I'm going to jump 28 feet or 35 feet, and then set that as your DC, which the higher you go is going to increase your chance of failing and critically failing. And when you fail, you default back to whatever your leap would be, which could be only jumping forward 10 feet or 15 feet. So you get in this weird situation where if you're legendary in athletics, you can say, I'm going to jump 50 feet. But you roll a 49 instead, and instead of jumping 50 feet forward, you jump 15. Now, you just have to do a DC 15 athletics check. And if you succeed, you look at the number you rolled, and that's how far you jump. Now, this is simpler. However, okay, what if you want to jump onto a pillar? You don't want to jump farther than 35 feet, which the old current rule accommodates, because this says you travel the distance equal to your roll, even if you don't want to go that far. There should be an option. The way I'm going to run it is that the player can choose either or. Also, we see a little change to swim. If the water is calm, in most instances, you automatically critically succeed. That's a nice quality of life change, reducing the number of rolls in combat for something that most people would assume heroes can do. It also, interestingly, assumes everybody knows how to swim. Well, it's fantasy heroes. We can assume that they can, I guess. Then we were shown a couple of pages of general feats, and I noticed monster crafting. I think this is new. A master survival feat that lets the player craft items using monster parts. Now, there's an excellent third-party book by Roll for Combat called Battles du Bestiary, which gives a whole system for using monster parts to improve items in unique ways. That's compatible with Pathfinder 2e. That exists. This does the simple act of allowing you to use your survival skill instead of your crafting skill. It's a nice buff to a skill that could use a buff. It doesn't seem to replace the requirement to have a feat to make certain kinds of items, notably magical items. So you still need to have magical crafting and have training in the crafting skill. But if you are focused on survivalism, you are not left behind in the crafting race. Also, I liked seeing No Cause for Alarm. That's a general feat from the Advanced Player's Guides. Nice to see it here in the Player Core book. They talked about the new pet feat, a new general feat that allows anybody to have an animal friend. Unlike the current nature feat that lets you have the ability to train an animal, this gives you something that scales with your level so that it doesn't become vulnerable after a few adventures. It operates like a familiar in that you get a limited number of abilities that you can add to it. You can't change it every morning. It's when you gain your pet. And these are the abilities that are less magical that we are familiar with from the familiar list. So it can have the ability to fly, so like the flying cat, or scent, but not some of the crazier things you see in the familiar list. So this is really cool. It means that you can, if you have access to a general feat, at least at level 1, have a pet that assists you in some way, gives you some utility. It's not a combatant, not like an animal companion, but come on, a lot of people want to have animals, and I've taught RPGs to middle schoolers, and I know this. And it means you don't have to be a druid or ranger to get a pet. Now, not every character could have a general feat at level 1. I think if a player in one of my campaigns really wanted this at level 1 and was an orc or a halfling and doesn't have a free general feat, then I would adapt the rules from the Game Mastery Guide for Deep Backgrounds that says if you randomly roll a non-skill feat on one of its charts, you can get that feat, but you don't get the skill training from your background. So I would allow them to have a custom background that includes this feat, but doesn't have the main skill proficiency that you see with nearly every other background. Now, I saw some commentary online about this last paragraph, which is very interesting. It says special, and the last part says, if you later gain a familiar or other companion that uses the pet feat, you can immediately retrain this feat. So this implies that if you were to gain a familiar or a companion, there's going to be some reference to this feat, that this is kind of a base for those. So it's possible that familiars, at least, will have 2 of these abilities for free and possibly gain access, possibly, to more abilities. So there's a possible buff to familiars, maybe, maybe not. Or this could just simply be a way to demarcate different abilities that are exclusive to familiars only. We will see. They also then talked about equipment, and Jason Woolman mentioned how the setup time you need to craft currently, which is 4 days, is now being reduced to 2 days. And if you have a formula for what you're crafting, that's reduced to 1 day. And this is kind of a big deal because that was one of the common complaints, how much time would require in downtime to craft. But also, if getting a formula reduces its time to craft, do you need a formula at all? It's kind of implied that you don't in order to craft something, so long as you have the feat required to craft something. One of the complaints about crafting was that it didn't seem to give you much benefit. And one of the things I've said in response to that is that the main benefit of formulas is to give your party access to items it normally doesn't have access to. If you live in a level 6 settlement, for example, you cannot find items that are higher than level 6. And having the formula lets you surpass that limit. But the counterpoint to my counterpoint was that you can't get level 7 or higher formulas in that settlement. You have to purchase them in a higher level settlement. It seems to me that they are lifting the cap. If so long as you are the level required for the item, you can craft something even if you are in a lower level settlement. So the intended aim of what crafting is supposed to allow you to do, it's not going to have that obstacle of having to find that formula. They also really quickly mentioned the sidebar for the equipment section in the player core, which is nice. Another example of how it will be much easier to find what you're looking for in the book. We then were shown some spells, and what they focused on was Cleanse Affliction, being a one-stop shop, they called it, for treating poison, treating diseases, and removing curses. This way you have a more flexible spell. And also, I found interesting that you have a second level version that might not completely remove the affliction, but can at least reduce its stage by 1. What's grouped here are the afflictions, things that progress in stages. And this, without a roll needed, reduces that stage. That's a nice automatic guarantee you get. Actually removing the affliction entirely requires a counteract check. Clear Mind is analogous. It has the effect of removing mental effects like fleeing, frightened, and stupefied. These are not afflictions, not things with tracks. What this does is gives you a chance to counteract them. And if you don't succeed, if you would have succeeded if the rank of the effect was 2 ranks lower, you at least suppress it until the start of your next turn. Of course, this adds a little complexity to maybe the most complex rule in the game. However, the intent and what it adds to the game, I think, is good because you have the partial effect even on a failure. So it's like 4 degrees of success inside 4 degrees of success. But yeah, it mitigates the feels bad of counteracting. And maybe we'll see this in other instances. Hopefully it'll be presented better than in some word salad. Well, anyway, the rule change is welcome, that opportunity, but I think it is going to be confusing to players. A couple of other things that stood out to me. It was pointed out on my server. The charm spell has a new trait we have not heard about before, the subtle trait. It's often been a source of arguments when a player casts a spell like suggestion or charm, whether bystanders will know that a spell was cast. And also even the recipient, if they succeed on their saving throw, do they know that there was an attempt made? It looks like we're going to get some rule support to make clear what spells are subtle and what are not, since the verbal and somatic components to spellcasting are now removed. I was confused in a previous video as to whether spells would require speaking in a strong voice and doing something visual that makes it obvious that you're casting a spell, which is important for 2 situations. One, that you're trying to set up an ambush before opening that dungeon door or front door, or what this seems to be addressing, whether it's obvious you're trying to use magic to influence someone in a social situation. Now, it seems like, yes, there are obvious things to your spellcasting, and I'm going to guess the tradition of speaking in a strong voice exists as well, because we now have a trait that will seem to negate these things. We haven't seen the actual text of what subtle does, but it looks like there is now some more rule support in this otherwise murky area. I also, have wanted to know whether ventriloquism, message, ghost sound, all these things, whether it's obvious you are voicing these sounds or doing something, it would be nice to see whether the subtle trait applies to those. They also talked about how Magic Weapon and Magic Fang are now replaced by spells that heighten to provide greater benefits at higher level. And they gave a sneak peek of the new character sheet, which is much cleaner, uses a lot less ink than the current character sheet. Here's the current sheet, which, for people who see Pathfinder as too complicated to learn kind of was a barrier to entry, just the sight of this character sheet, in my opinion. And I'm glad that they've are now revising it. Here's the second page of the current character sheet. Here are the current pages, the first 2 pages. I'm assuming there's going to be a more pages to allow for spells of the new character sheet from the remaster. My one complaint is that I've been saying for a while, and I think I'm not the only one, that the attack bonus should allow 3 spaces, not only for your full accuracy bonus, but also applying the 2 attacks with increasing multiple attack penalty. That's going to lower the barrier to entry and make the game easier to play. But fortunately, we do have some white space up here that could be used. But yeah, I would like them to put out an alternate version. I also think that some things that are much more vital, like armor class and your hit points, could have popped out more. Kind of the treatment we see in the beginner box character sheet. And here's that sheet for reference. The clear important things are orange. And this would print well on a black and white printer, I think. And there's kind of too much equal emphasis to lots of different things. Like fortitude is about the same emphasis as your acrobatic skill. But anyway, still a big improvement from what existed before. Then they moved on to previewing the GM core, which I'm sure many people are interested in, but there's going to be less crunch affecting the mechanics of the game and the experience of all players. So they kind of spent less time on this, and so will I. They did show the table of contents, however, and it was pretty clear that there's a lot of material in the Game Mastery Guide right now, which is about a 250 or 300 page book that's not going to be here. However, that's completely understandable because they are splitting the current core rulebook into 2 parts, essentially, allowing for a lot of the equipment to move here. So not all of the variant rules are here. They are limited to 4 pages, in fact, that we see in the current Game Mastery Guide. Also, notably, the NPC gallery of the current Game Mastery Guide is not going to be here. They made it pretty clear when they previewed the Monster Core book that we may get NPCs there. They said that there will be a halfling fighter in the Monster Core book. So it seems like the Monster Core book will also serve as an NPC book for GMs. But otherwise, this table of contents is also where they moved the lore of the Age of Lost Omens. And we have the presentation here of a lot of the rules that are GM-facing in the core rulebook. But it seems like from the page count and the section titles that they're going to have a lot of the excellent support and advice for the GM that we currently see in the Game Mastery Guide, as well as rules for making your own monsters, homebrewing your own adventures, and magic items. They also showed the sidebar in their screenshots. It's much more detailed. It's just easier to jump from section to section and to find exactly what you're looking for. For example, if you go into the Building Games chapter, you can see this whole list of things, including the variant rules. And if you want to build creatures, flip to that page. And those familiar with these books know that as you flip the pages, the little highlight is going to move downward as you flip forward through the book. And a big deal for me, the current core rulebook, it's very hard to navigate the magic items section. The sidebar gives you no help at that department, and you have to kind of study the order and memorize it to know where to find your alchemical consumable item. But now the sidebar is much more helpful in this regard, with subsections and subsections to the subsections, making it clear where you can find alchemy items, which are cordoned off from other consumables which have their own section. It is a godsend to me, who was very annoyed and found it hard to find the section I wanted to find things in the current book. It was one of my few complaints about the organization of the core rulebook, in fact. They also gave this screenshot from the subsystems chapter and commented a bit about how chases will less often have this situation where you come up against an obstacle and that one person who played a fighter with very few skills has nothing to do or contribute to an obstacle that requires using their mental skills because they didn't train on them, and the party telling that player to not do anything because it's more likely to harm the party than help it. They have done some design work to mitigate that problem. They did not go into more detail, but that's welcome. And they also said they did some work to the research subsystem. They didn't go into detail there, but sounds like they were overall, of course, trying to improve things. They also showed on the screen a magic item that I think is new to Pathfinder 2e, but they didn't talk about it, which is the Madcap Top. You spin it and you roll a d20, and there's just some really fun effects involved, where you target a creature within 60 feet, and it can do a whole variety of things, including make yourself look like the target, flinging 1 copper piece at you, 4 singing skeletons appear to serenade you and your allies, giving you bonuses, together with some quite useful things. That looks like a fun item, though rare, that I absolutely would include in my campaigns. And they wrapped up by showing some sneak peeks at artwork from the Monster Core coming up, and the new Player Core too, where they told us again what ancestries and classes to look forward to, and I think for the first time revealed that there would be a Tripkey ancestry, a frog ancestry, which I have not heard more about or much discussion about online. I'm guessing it is a reimagining of the Gripply ancestry, if not a carbon copy of it with a new name, which already was different from D&D's Grungs, so I don't know exactly what's going on there. It's not a heritage, but they did hint in their product copy on their website that there'd be an all-new heritage. This is not a heritage, but it is the one ancestry they did not list here, so I'm a little confused. So that's kind of it. I'm excited more than I was before about the new remaster that comes out in November. Like and subscribe and ring the bell if you want to get my continuing coverage. I'm likely going to get a preview copy and we'll be reviewing parts of it before the street dates. Also, if you haven't yet, join my Discord community where we talk Pathfinder 2e. We also have drop-in games of Pathfinder 2e where you can take your character from adventure to adventure with gathering loot and XP along the way. We also talk other gaming. Also, people set up games with a beginner box. And support my Patreon where you can get 7-day early access to most of my videos and also get access to exclusive content. So that's it. I have been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I hope you found this video informative, and I'll see you next time.